Hi, I'm Chad with Move for Guitar. This lesson is from our series Music Theory for Guitar. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about upper intervals of the major scale. First off, download our free e-guide, Music Theory for Guitar. It contains everything that I'm talking about in this lesson, all the charts and diagrams, as well as much more, so it'll be really useful to you. And like I said, it's free, so there's no reason not to just go download that. But I am working on it right now as I'm filming this lesson, so it may not be available as you're watching this lesson. And if it's not available yet, it'll say coming soon. And if you'd like to get notified when it is available, you can sign up for our mailing list and we'll send you a notification for when it is available and let you download it. And also, if you're signed up for our mailing list, you'll receive all updated versions as well. But don't worry, you don't need the e-guide to follow along with this lesson because all the charts and diagrams will be on the screen. And also, we add at least one new lesson every day, so be sure to subscribe. This is part 10 in our series Music Theory for Guitar. If you'd like to go back and start at the beginning, you can click the link on the screen. So in these last lessons, we've been talking about the major scale. I talked about what the major scale is, how to construct it, intervals of the major scale, and major scale patterns. In this lesson, I want to go back and talk about intervals again. And this is something I purposely left out the first time when I talked about intervals of the major scale, just to keep it from being confusing. But I think it's important to give this a little overview now so that it's not confusing down the road. So here again is the F major scale over the whole fretboard. But again, like we've been doing, I'm not worried that this is an F major scale. We're only looking at this as intervals. These intervals would stay the same no matter what key we're in, meaning what root we were starting on, but it would just shift these shapes to different spots on the fretboard if we started on a different root, which I'm assuming you understand that at this point if you've come this far through these lessons. So at the beginning we talked about intervals before we were talking about the major scale, and we talked about intervals all the way up to an octave, which is an 8. And then I showed you the intervals of the major scale, which were root, major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, and then back to a root 1 octave higher, or you could just consider it root 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then those intervals would just repeat over and over again. You'd start at the next root and do the exact same interval structure. And that's what you're seeing over this whole fretboard on this diagram. And those are the intervals of the major scale. That's how you would view the major scale as far as intervals. But there's something else that you need to understand, and that's upper intervals. And intervals don't actually stop at 8. And 8, like I just said, and you should know, is the octave from where you started. If we were to start right here, as this as being our root note, and went up to this, this note right here is 1 octave higher than the one we started on. So if you were to count it, it would be root 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then this root again would be an 8. So before I told you that then you just repeat it over again. You'd start at root and then you go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, then you start over again. And that's true if you were looking at this as starting from each of these root notes. But if you were looking at this as starting from this very first root, if you were to go up to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then your octave, which is 8, this next 2 would actually be a 9, because this would be the interval of a 9 between these two notes. And then the next one would actually be a 10. So this 3 right here would be a 10 compared to this root. And this 4 would be an 11 compared to this root. Or you could look at it going more vertically. If we started with this root again, you'd have 2, 3, 4 right here, and I'm basically staying in major scale pattern 1, 5, 6, 7, and then root again, which is your 8, and then this next one, which says 2, would actually be a 9 compared to this root. It's a 2 compared to this root, it's a major second compared to this one, but if we compare it to the one we started with, the lowest one, it's actually 9. And then this 3 is actually 10 compared to this root. This 4 is actually 11 compared to this root. But if you were just comparing it to this root, this would be a 2, this would be a 3, this would be a 4, this would be a 5, and so on. And that's a little confusing to think about at this point, and you don't need to really think about that too much at this point. I just want to point that out to begin with. What we are going to focus on in this lesson are the intervals of the 9, the 11, and the 13. We're not going to worry about any of the upper intervals past that. And that's because the 9 and 11 and 13 are your most important intervals past the octave, and that's because they're used in building chords, so they're very important to understand. And we're not going to get into building chords in this lesson, but that's why we're using the 9, 11, and 13, not the 10, 12, and so on. And just to make it really clear, we're going to go to pattern 1, major scale pattern 1, which you should know this by now. And I'm just going to cover what I just said again, just to make sure that it's really clear. So as you can see, I've just repeated 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 over and over. If we look at this scale and take out everything past the 7 for now, just to make it really simple, if we're looking at this pattern, what it would actually be if you were starting on this root, the lowest root note, it would actually look like this. So now your octave up is an 8, although you'd still just call that a root, an octave higher. The 2 above that would be the 9, and then so on. Again, we're only going to focus on the 9, 11, and 13, but I just want to give a clearer picture of how that would look compared to this root. But if you were looking starting from the second root, which was right here, those would stay at 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 because you're basing those intervals off of this root and the distance from this root, not off of this root that was here. So hopefully that just clarifies a little more. But like I said, we're only going to worry about the 9, 11, and 13 in this lesson because those are the most important ones and those are used for building chords. And we're also not going to worry about where the 9, 11, and 13 land compared to what root they're coming from. All we're going to look at and consider right now is that the 9 is the same as a 2, the 11 is same as the 4, and a 13 is same as the 6th. And many people, most people, when they're talking about intervals and when they're talking about scales and chords, they use those interchangeably. So the 2 is the same as the 9, the 4 is the same as an 11, and the 6 is the same as a 13. So major scale pattern 1 would look like this. Root, and then you'd have 2 or 9, 3, 4 or 11, 5, 6 or 13, and so on. And technically this second one right here, 2, which says 2 or 9, would not be a 9 because it's not coming off of anything that much lower. It's coming off this lowest root, which makes it a 2. But in all practical purposes, when people are talking about intervals, you'll very often see 2 and 9 interchanged just like they're the same thing, 4 and 11 interchanged just like they're the same thing, and 6 and 13 interchanged just like they're the same thing. And for now, that's all you really need to focus on, that 2 is the same as 9, 4 is the same as 11, and 6 is the same as 13. And another way to think about it is that a 9 is an octave higher than a 2, an 11 is an octave higher than a 4, and a 13 is an octave higher than a 6. Just like this root would be an 8 because it's an octave higher than this root. So then we can look at the whole scale that way and just replace all the 2, 4, and 6s to be 2 or 9, 4 or 11, 6 or 13. And in just practical purposes, you'll run across that all the time. But in later lessons, we'll talk about what the real differences are, and we'll talk about bigger interval shapes and all that. But for now, just consider what I just said, that the 2 is the same as the 9, the 4 is the same as 11, and 6 is the same as 13. But one thing I should mention, just to make it really clear, when you're talking about the intervals of a major scale, you would say to build a major scale is the root, the major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, and root again. You wouldn't say the 9, 11, and 13. Because when you're talking about building a scale, you're just talking about one octave, so you wouldn't go past that to the 9 or 11 or 13. So don't let this be confusing to you. I just need to point it out now because you'll run across this all the time. Like I said, we'll dive deeper into the differences between a 2 and a 9, 4 and 11 more in other lessons, but for now just consider them the same thing or just interchangeable. And a lot of times you'll see scales written out this way where they're both in the same dot, representing that they could be either. And download the e-guide as a reference again. It'll be really handy to you. And you can just move on. We're going to continue with the major scale and really dive into making everything make sense. And like I keep saying, if things aren't clear now, we'll continually fill in all the gaps, and by the time you're done, this will all make sense to you. And be sure to subscribe because we add at least one new lesson every day.